Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to our regulars and welcome to anybody that's here for the first time. Also, if there are any Mizrahi people, then welcome to you as well. We do this every week and you're welcome to join us, and I'll just tease you a little bit with our guests for next week, and we'll announce that at the end of the session. My name is Alan Friedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association, and I am the MC for this evening. Also visible on your screens are David Adler, President of the AJA, as well as our special guest for tonight, Professor David Newman, who we will introduce formally in a moment. Tonight's topic is an interesting one. We've all had our brains twisted around, and that is Israel's electoral system. What we're going to do is have a presentation by David for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience. And just a reminder, or if you're new to us, the way to ask a question is to raise your hand electronically, and you do that by clicking on the participants or the reactions buttons at the bottom of your screen. That sends a little signal to us, and then we put you in the line to ask questions. And the chat function is available as usual, and I noticed Terry's already announced that he's an Arsenal fan, so well, we can't all be perfect. Okay, so to most of us in the diaspora, the Israeli electoral system is one of unending confusion, instability, and debate, and it seems to parallel the old saying of 2 Jews, 3 opinions, but albeit in a much larger version. So tonight we have just the man to help unravel it all for us. David Newman is Professor of Geopolitics at Ben-Gurion University, where he has been since 1987 after making Aliyah in 1982. His degrees are from the University of London and Durham in the UK, and at Ben-Gurion University he has founded and developed a range of academic departments. In 2013, David was awarded an OBE by the British government for his services in promoting scientific cooperation between Israel and the UK. And in 2017, which was Israel's 70th anniversary, he was chosen as one of the 100 most influential immigrants to Israel from the UK. I won't read out the rest of the CV, which is quite extensive, other than to mention that it does conclude with him saying that he is a fervent supporter of Tottenham Hotspur. And for those that don't understand Yiddish, fervent means passionate or ardent. But I mentioned earlier that to 99% of us here in the colonies, this might not be something we get too excited about. David, welcome to Australia via Zoom, and thanks for your time today.
Okay, let me just get back into share screen now. Am I on share screen?
You are, so please take it away whenever you're ready.
Okay, 1 second. Let me make sure this works. Okay, I'm in share screen. Okay, I would say good afternoon to you all, and of course, good evening to you all in Australia. It's just about 1 o'clock here in Israel. I'm sitting in Meitar, which is community I've lived in for the last over 30 years in the south of Israel, just north of Beersheba. I'm sure that many of you, despite the long distance, often visit Israel, and I'm sure that many of you don't get as far as coming south of what they say Castina. If and when you next come, give me a call and come and see the south of the country, because it's a lot of interesting things going on there. You mentioned the colonies. I thought it'd be more polite to say the Commonwealth. I suppose in the Australian audience, people may even know what this funny thing the OBE actually is, which is not necessarily the case in, say, North America or many other English-speaking communities. But I'm very pleased to be with you today. When we originally discussed this topic for one of your sessions, then we were still trying to put a government together after the 4th elections. And it didn't look as though it was going to actually happen. But it has happened. The government's been in place now for 6 weeks, 2 months, sorry. And it's sticking it out there. It's not easy. Those of you who follow Israeli politics, probably more than we do here, because we get so fed up with it sometimes, it becomes a bit of a soap opera, who's voting in favor and who's voting against, and will the government come down, be pulled down, or will it continue? But it's somehow managing to stay together, and it is, of course, very different, a very interesting government, not in the sense of the number of parties that it has holding it together, more than even normal, but nevertheless, that's not such a rarity in Israeli politics. But the fact that there's no one large party at the center of it, as was always the case with Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Likud, and the fact that it really has come together pretty much across the Israeli political spectrum, with the exception of the Haredi parties, which refused to come into it and are now complaining they're not part of it because they held a very strong loyalty to Prime Minister Netanyahu. And of course, the reason these parties came together was because of their opposition to the continuation of Mr. Netanyahu. You're in Australia, so I think you eat Vegemite in Australia. I'm an ex-Brit, and there are only two things I still bring back from England to Israel when I return, as I often do, to London. One are good, strong English tea bags, and the other is Marmite. And Vegemite, I understand, is the Australian version of Marmite. I once wrote a piece comparing Marmite to Prime Minister Netanyahu in the simple sense, you either hate it or you love it. There's no middle road on the two things. And of course, a lot of putting this government together was about, do you hate or do you support Mr. Netanyahu? That was very much what this government was putting together. And although I don't tend to give you an analysis of what's going on in the government today, I think it is fair to say that many of the political commentators here feel that for as long as Mr. Netanyahu stays leader of the opposition Likud, the chances of this very complicated and very complex government of staying together despite all of its internal differences is stronger. In other words, it would start to split up at the point where the Likud did decide to have a new leader. And then, of course, any one of a number of people would feel that they could go up against him, whether it be Yair Lapid, whether it even be the current Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, who's only in there with 6 seats, but he played a very clever, crafty political game, understanding well the way to manipulate the existing system. And it has to be said that since he's been in power, I may not share, this is a British understatement, I may not share his right-wing views, but in many other aspects, he seems to be managing the government fairly well. And I think there is a feeling in Israel that a lot of other stables needed to be cleared out, leaving aside the left-right-wing divide, that there was a lot of issues to do with the administration of the country, whether it be in health or welfare or economics or education, that needed a bit of cleaning out. And in those sort of issues, this new government, so far, it's early days, but seems to have come together quite well and seems to be putting those issues behind them. Of course, what's back in the top of the news right today is the fact we thought it was behind us, but it's come back to us now. The corona figures are going up again, and the government are thinking about putting new measures back into place. And we may even be the first country in the world which has a third vaccination. The government and the cabinet are going to debate that over the next few days. But this government, with all of its internal differences and with all of its internal potential instability, seems to be working reasonably well. How long that can go on for, you don't know. As I said, if Mr. Netanyahu were to decide either to step down or if the Likud were to decide to get rid of him, which is unlikely, or if a big issue concerning the Israel-Palestine conflict was to come up on the table, and that's the issue where, of course, this new government is very much internally divided, that could cause major problems. So far, it hasn't happened, and we wait to see. We're all very pleased that we didn't have to go to a 5th election, because it's obvious that a 5th election would not have brought a greatly different result to the 4th or the 3rd or the 2nd or the 1st. A seat this way, a seat that way. And again, the normal 6 or 8 weeks afterwards of negotiation, bargaining, of trying to put a government together. So I think at least on that area, most Israelis, whether they're right wing or left wing, fairly pleased that we didn't have to get to a 5th election. Excuse my coughing, it's got nothing to do with Corona. I must have swallowed something recently in the last hour or so. So we're quite pleased there's no 5th election, and the country moves ahead. It is quite amazing, given the way that we run our elections and the number of elections that we've had in the last few years, that this country does manage itself. It runs ahead. Its economy is still pretty stable and pretty healthy. And most of the systems of civil society function and work in the Israeli style, of course. But nevertheless, it functions well. And I think the way that Israel has dealt with COVID or Corona up to now, and the huge amount of resources obviously the government has had to put into it, in paying unemployment benefits, in putting the 2 vaccinations into place, many other issues, has proven actually that we do have a very strong and healthy economy. And again, as I say, you can hate or love the previous prime minister, but he was in power for 12 years, very shrewd political dealer. And while everyone focuses on those issues in which they disagree with him, there were many issues in which he was very successful, not least in stabilizing and putting on a very firm footing the economy of the state of Israel. So let's talk about the system and ask ourselves, why did we need 4 elections in the space of 2 years, and why did we nearly come to a 5th one? Why was it so difficult to put this government together once again? What you can see here, by the way, is an advert that was put up before every election, which people like my son, who's a PhD student at Tel Aviv University, actually he was offered a fully paid PhD in Sydney, New South Wales. And had it not been for Corona, that's where he could well have been right now. Needless to say that his mother, my wife, is very pleased he's not so far away with his wife and his young child. But he could well have been in Sydney at this very moment studying, but Corona proved to be too much of a problem to overcome. Many of the people of his age earned a lot of money out of these last elections. Students, every one of the election boothing polls requires people to be employed on election day to oversee the system, to make sure everything is efficiently managed, to make sure there are no issues of fraud and so on. And they're paid quite well to do that. So he's had 4 opportunities in the last 2 years. And for those of you who understand Hebrew, can see that he was answering to an advert of the state of Israel, looking for people to undertake those jobs. When I normally present this topic, what I normally do is I talk about the Israeli election system, how it works, how it functions, and I compare it often to the British system, which of course is a system I know very well from growing up there and being interested. I sometimes teach British politics here at the Israeli universities, because they're the 2 opposite extremes of how an electoral system works. Australia is somewhere else on the spectrum, and if we have time, we'll come back to that and make a comparison. But the Israeli system, with all of the critique of how difficult it is to put a government together, I think 1 or 2 things have to be made very clear. It's an extremely democratic and an extremely proportional system. I mean, in that sense, it is far, far better than, for instance, the British system, the first past the post system, where so many of the votes really don't account for anything at the end of the day. In Israel, you have a single constituency. Actually, Israel and Holland are the only 2 real Western democracies in the world which don't have constituencies. The whole country is one constituency. And every group of people, let's call it that, who feel that they can set up a party, get the minimum number of people to sign on, which will allow them to register as a party, who believe that they can get beyond the lower threshold of votes needed to get into the Knesset will put together a party, and they'll put together a list of people in the larger parties such as the Likud, or what was the Labour Party, let's say Kahol Lavan or Yesh Atid of Yair Lapid today. They will often have internal primaries, not always, but some of them will, and they will elect the people on the list from number 1 through to whatever number they think they've got a reasonable chance of getting into the Knesset. And if a party, let's say, gets 15% of the votes, it's going to get 15%, give or take a percentage point or two. So it could be, say, between 14 to 16 or even 13 to 17% of the seats. So you could say that's a really democratic system. That's a very proportional system. It is. It means that every sector, every group that feels that a certain political leader, or whether they're an Arab party or a Haredi party, who want to run on their very narrow sectoral concerns, if they believe they can get that number of votes, then they know they're in the Knesset. If they know they're in the Knesset, and by the way, 3.25% today is much larger than it used to be in the past, when it was even more problematic. For many years, you only needed to get 1% of the votes. But 3.25% of the votes today mean that you're going to get into the Knesset with a minimum of 4 seats, which of course is better than being in there with a minimum of 1 or 2 seats. But because it's so difficult to put the coalition together, it's the smaller parties, the ones with the 4, 5, and 6 seats, who have the greater bargaining power, because if you need 61 to have the majority in the Knesset, there are 120 seats in the Knesset, so you must get at least 61. And let's say parties put together coalitions, which they get to 45, then they get to 50, and then to 55. And they need those last 3 or 4 seats to get beyond the 60. So the smaller parties have tremendous bargaining power, disproportionate bargaining power in coming into the government, getting a certain number of seats around the cabinet table, being allocated sectoral resources for their own cultural or educational or social projects. And so the smaller parties, because of this system of proportionality, has a disproportionate amount of power, which of course is one of the negative aspects of how the system is run. Unlike many other aspects of Israeli political and social system, much of which was inherited from the British Mandate, such as the system of local government or such as the judicial system, the electoral system was not inherited from the Brits. The electoral system was inherited from the Zionist parties. That's how they run their affairs in the pre-state days. They had party lists, and of course at the time the 2 big lists were the Labour Zionists, the Mapai of Ben-Gurion and Arlosoroff, and the revisionist Zionists of Jabotinsky, and so on. And there were other, and the Mizrahi were a smaller group. But they also run the system very similar to the way in which the first Israeli governments inherited the political system. Interestingly enough, and I'll come back to this in a minute, Ben-Gurion didn't like it. He wanted actually to change the electoral system and have a different system. But nevertheless, his own party, despite his own power of the time, his own party didn't allow him to change the system, because they understood that this was the way, at least in the first 30 years of statehood, that the Labour Party, the Mapai, were going to stay in power. You used to often get on election night that if the results showed that it had shifted from the Labour Party to the Likud, or from the Likud to the Labour Party, by just 1 or 2 seats, you often had, when the polls closed at 10 o'clock in the evening, you often had the television lead up, such as Chaim Yavin, he was a very famous political commentator on Israeli TV, saying, there's been a revolution, government has changed. If yesterday the Labour Party had a majority, today the Likud have a majority. But that was never really the case. There's only been one, in my view at least, one major revolution in the Israeli electoral history, and that was in 1977 when Menachem Begin led the then Cherut Likud to the first ever real switch in government that had ever taken place in Israel's political history. For the first 30 years, it had always been a Labour Party-led government. And for the first time in 1977, Begin, who had managed to stay head of the Likud for the whole of the 30 years, despite losing the elections, managed, together with a centrist party of Dash at the time, of Yigal Yadin, of taking over power. Much of that, of course, was due to the disappointment from the way that the Yom Kippur War had been managed, but also for many other reasons. And I think it's fair to say that Menachem Begin was the person who enfranchised many groups within Israeli society, be they the Mizrahi groups, the Sephardi groups of the development towns, be they the Haredi groups who had never been actually in power before. He was the person who changed the political agenda of Israel. And since 1977 until today, there's been a straight fight. There's never been a real hegemony of any one party. On the contrary, it could be said that in the last 15, 20 years, the hegemonic party of Israel has been the Likud, not the Mapai, which virtually doesn't exist today. The Labour Party has 6 or 7 seats today. The real hegemony of the last 20 years has been the Likud under the leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu. There have been periods when we have what we call a government of national unity because they couldn't get the government together. But I would say many people believe the so-called governments of national unity are more governments of national paralysis, because what it means is that the major right-wing force and the major left-wing force balance each other out and don't move ahead at all on the big issues facing Israel in terms of foreign affairs, the Israel-Palestine issue, the West Bank, Ben-Gurion's, and so on. Although I think we've rather overdone the response to Ben-Gurion's. Ladies and gentlemen, Israel today makes some really great boutique local ice cream, which is just as good as Ben-Gurion's. So when you next come to Israel, don't worry, there's really good ice cream to be had. One of the best, interestingly enough, comes from my part of the world. It's actually called Glidat Beersheva ice creams, and it's one of the best ice creams in Israel today. So we're not too worried about Ben-Gurion's. Obviously, there's larger dimensions in terms of what it means in terms of media and the attitude towards Israel, but we're not too worried about the ice cream itself. So that's the history of the electoral system, and we haven't really got around to changing it over time. Let's just move. Okay, one major change that has taken place, which we thought would stabilize the system, has been that the lower thresholds for getting into the Knesset have indeed been raised over time. For the first 30 or 40 years of government, it was no more than 1%, which meant to say that if you just got 1% of the votes, you were going to end up in the Knesset with 2 seats. And unlike today, where the minimum is 4 or 5 seats, even with 2 seats, you could determine which of the 2 larger parties was going to be in government. And if you didn't like something that was going on, you just had to withdraw your support from the coalition government. And on the basis of a single vote, the government would come crashing down. Over time, it was raised to 1.5%, raised again to 2%, and today it's 3.25%. Some people argue that this is going too high and that too many votes are wasted. But when you compare it to systems around the country, I'm not sure what the percentage is within the constituencies in Australia, but when you compare it to some of other countries around the world, they often have lower thresholds of 8% and 10%. So it's not really such a high percentage. Yes, there are always going to be some votes that go to waste, but it's a relatively small amount. And it means that the really minute party fragments had to get together to make sure they had 3%, which is why in the last few elections, excepting this very last one, The Arab parties got together in a single list. The Haredi parties operated together because they realized it wasn't enough just to operate on every single thing that divided them, because they then may not pass the 3.25%. And it meant that you had at least medium-sized parties. Even if in Israel today, accepting the Likud, there is no really large party left within the political system. Back in the 60s, 70s, the Likud and the Labour Party used to be on 40 seats each after an election, and they had to get together another 20 from the smaller parties. Today, the only party that has got more than 30 seats is the Likud, and most parties have less than 20 seats. So there's no large political game to be played out there at the moment. And again, this is one of the drawbacks of the system that we have. You can see how the electoral threshold has grown over time. As I say, some would like to put it up even more, and some of the smaller factions say, no, this is too much, and you are in essence excluding us from playing the political game. Participation in Israeli elections has traditionally been very high. Israel is a very politically orientated country, but even that has fallen in recent years. If you look back in 1949, in the earliest elections, we were always over 80%. And as we move towards the more recent years, we're down to around 70 and even below 70%. Now, for many countries, that's still a high figure. You look at the United States, you look at Britain. Again, I don't know what the figure is in Australia. I should have checked it out for today. But often 50%, 55, 60% is considered an average participation, unless excepting in the countries, of course, where you have to vote by law. I'm talking about countries where you don't have to necessarily vote and you're not fined for not voting. Israel, you're not fined for not voting. No one makes you go to vote. But nevertheless, even in what we call lower participation levels of recent years, we're down to 67, 68, 70%, which is considered to be very low. And one of the reasons for that is because there's a feeling of apathy towards the political system. Another election. To put a coalition government together, you have to give out nearly as many cabinet seats as there are members of Knesset. They have what they call here the Norwegian law, which, if you ask me, is a bit of a fraud, whereby everyone who is made a minister can then vacate their seat in the Knesset. It then goes to the next person in the party. But if for whatever reason, over the period of the government, you resign or are fired, you can then take back your seat in the Knesset, and the guy who came in your place has to leave the Knesset. So number one, it means you don't take any risks, which a political system should be about taking risks. And secondly, it means that you can have as many cabinet seats as you want. Every party running for government always says, we are going to introduce a law which limits the number of government seats and ministries, and every one of those ministries is a huge budget. It needs offices, it needs assistants and advisors and cars and budgets. So everyone always runs for government saying, we're going to limit the number of cabinet seats. We're not going to have more than 20, which already is a high number. It's 1 in every 6. But of course, when they come to the coalition discussions, the smaller parties will only come in if they're given a sufficient number of cabinet government seats. So then they'll tell you, well, this is the price we have to pay for democracy, because otherwise we couldn't get a government together. But next time we'll do it properly. But of course, it never happens. And that's the case with this government and the one that was put together 2 years ago as well. So as you can understand, there is increasing apathy towards the political system from a younger generation who see politics in a very different way to the older generation, the state founding generation. Remember that Israel is a very young country. Remember that something like 65% of the country were born after the Lebanon War took place, and something like 75 to 80% of the country were born after the Six-Day War. So remember, for those of you who are of a generation who grew up in the 50s, maybe many of you were around at the time of the establishment of the state, the way that the people see the political system They see Israel's role in the world. They see the system of globalization. They're worried about their economy, their employment, their houses, their families. They're not mostly focused on issues relating to Zionism and anti-Semitism and the role of Jews in the world. They see the political system very differently, and many of them feel that the system is, some would say corrupt, or some would say is not managed very well, and they would like to see it differently, and many are opting out of voting altogether, which of course is not good, is unhealthy for a democracy. As I say, so I've spoken about participation. There are a number of very powerful political figures in Israel, particularly in the religious world. I'm sure you can all identify who the face on these election adverts on the side of the Prima Hotel and the entrance to Jerusalem is, Rav Ovadia Yosef. But what's most interesting about these election adverts is that this was for the last election, 4 years after he passed away. But if Shas go out and use his name, Yisrael Bachar Bashem, which is really a religious phrase, Israel chooses God, but underneath there is a picture of Rav Ovadia Yosef, who for them represents God's word to the followers. This is still a very powerful political message. And I've often been asked, who are the really powerful political figures in Israel? Within parts of society, they are the ultra-Orthodox rabbinate, who can say vote or don't vote. And if you vote, vote for Shas or vote for Agudat Yisrael, and they can bring out 200,000 votes in an utterance or a saying. So of course the culture of democracy here also has a number of aspects which you won't find in other countries. There have been attempts to reform the system. Just looking at my watch. There have been attempts to reform the system over time. Ben-Gurion was in favor of reform. The first president, Herzog, was a great backer of electoral reform, particularly as he was in the president's office when what they call the Targil Masriach took place in the early 1990s, and between Shamir and Peres. And Peres worked behind Shamir's back to bring the government down, and Rabin wasn't very pleased with what happened, and so on. And then Rabin took over from Peres as head of the Labour Party at that time. President Herzog believed that we needed a different system, but then he was accused of interfering in political affairs, which a president should not do. But there was a lot of discussion at that time. We did experiment with the direct elections of prime minister. Maybe some of you remember about 20 years ago, we had 3 elections where we voted separately for a prime minister and separately for the Knesset. But of course, using great Jewish political wisdom, we didn't quite copy the systems where there was a separation of power, such as in France or in the United States of America, where a president or a prime minister directly voted has real executive powers. In our case, we voted for a prime minister who would still be part of the Knesset and would still need to put a coalition party together. And what happened was that the Israeli electorate split their votes even more than they did in the past, making it even more difficult to put a government together. And after 3 attempts at this, we went back to the old system with 1 or 2 important changes. And that was if prior to that reform, any 5 people in the Knesset could bring the government down. If you were there at a late night sitting, and let's say there were 9 people in the chamber, and you suddenly put forward a vote of confidence or no confidence, and you lost it, the government would come tumbling down. When they reverted back to the old system, they ensured that you would need a vote of 61 members in the House to bring the government down, which is why it is much more difficult to do so today than has been in the past. Until actually this past 3 years of election after election, we did go through a period where government stayed around for even 3+ years, which in Israel's reckoning is quite a long time. So you need 61 to bring a government down, which is not so easy. It's difficult enough to put the 61 together, So to get them after that, to bring the government down, and for them to know that they may be voting themselves out of power and out of their party list, because the public will get fed up with them continually going to elections. So they're much more careful about that today. There are no constituencies in Israel. There was a debate about that 20 or 30 years ago. There were even simulations done to see what would happen if we took the past results and put them into a system of constituencies. How would it work out, and how would you draw the constituencies? It was generally agreed there would have to be multi-member constituencies. Excuse me 1 minute, please. My wife just came back and she heard my hoarse voice, so she brought me a bottle of water. Thank you very much, Elaine. It would have to be multi-member constituencies, but that's commonly the system around the world. Again, Britain is, as they say, charig, in having just single-member systems and no mixed system of elections. So that simulation was done, but then there's the anti-constituency argument in Israel, which says we're a very small country, everybody knows each other. When Arik Sharon was prime minister, many of his ex-soldiers were mayors of local governments around the country, and when they had a problem in the local issues, they used to immediately run to Jerusalem to discuss it with Sharon directly. So there is an argument that you don't need constituencies in Israel. I don't buy that argument, by the way. But obviously, if there were constituencies, you would have to ensure that the Arab areas, the Haredi areas, were not gerrymandered in such a way that they did not vote in their own members of Knesset. Nobody is saying they should not have representation. What we're saying is there should be representation which allows for stable government. And what's even most interesting is that in the last 20 years, since the 1990s, there hasn't really been any serious debate about electoral reform in Israel. You would have thought that in the past 2 or 3 years, with election after election, someone would have come and put it back on the table as a serious debate. But it's not been there, and not even by the Israel Democracy Institute, which is a very good independent think tank about electoral matters and matters of democracy. And one of the reasons is because it would mean such a change to the nature of the sort of people who would be elected to power, running for constituencies, running in a mixed system and so on. It's very clear that no such proposal would get through the vote in the present Knesset, where most of the people obviously are in power. They benefit from being there from the present system itself. Again, constituencies, local accountability. I think it's fair to say that lots of the development towns and lots of the peripheral areas have risen in prominence, again, because of Begin, because of Sharon, over time, but they used to run directly to the prime minister. And as I say, it's not clear under today's political system how much more they would benefit. In the cases where local mayors have risen to prominence and have then moved from local government to national government, what you find, with 1 or 2 exceptions, within 6 months or a year, they've moved from their towns and moved to Tel Aviv or moved to Jerusalem and have put the local politics behind them. So it hasn't really worked out, this idea that constituencies give local representation. We live in the Negev. We often argue that for the Negev to get better planning resources, to get better zoning controls and so on, we need local members of parliament. But as I say, it hasn't been put to the test, so we don't really know. I showed you our direct elections. The other thing is, of course, that fixed elections, fixed term governments. There have been 24 elections in 72 years, 1 per 3 years. In some cases, of course, it's been even more frequent. There have been 36 governments in 72 years, average of 1 every 2 years, because you don't always have elections when governments change or they fire members or a new prime minister comes in and so on. But it would be, you can't have a fixed term government in Israel until you have a government which has at least, say, a 2/3 majority in the chamber. If you're going to continue to have governments which are, doesn't matter whether they have 5 parties or 9 parties in the system, But if it's always going to just reach 61 or 62, and you always know there are going to be one or two members of parliament, this government has already shown, who don't like a particular law and are not going to vote with the government tomorrow, what it means is the party leaders are spending most of their time in late night talks, convincing people to keep the coalition together, rather than in issues of administering the state and so on. So fixed term governments are important, but they can only be put into place when you have a different system as such. So overall, what we can say is that the Israeli system is extremely democratic. It's very proportional, and no one can criticize it for that. As someone said at the beginning when you introduced me, for every Israeli there are two opinions, but for every Israeli there are three political parties, which of course is the negative side of the system that we use. Direct elections of prime minister did not prove to be a success. It's not been on the agenda for the last 20 years. Politicians are not going to vote themselves and the way they do politics out of power. There's a big question mark as to whether constituencies are necessary. And I would say that there are no major changes on the horizon. Even if this government was to fall apart over the next few months and there was to be a fifth election within the next year, it would still be on the basis of the same system. It would be interesting to see if the new president, Isaac Bushi Herzog, like his father before him, would be interested in promoting the issue of electoral reform. That's yet to be seen, but of course he's also just come into the job and he needs time also to stabilize. I think he's a very popular choice for president. He has a political background. He has a Jewish world, the background of the Jewish Agency. There's no question that given the fact that his grandfather was the first chief rabbi, his father was the first president, his uncle was Abba Eban, another uncle was Yaakov Herzog, who was nearly appointed as chief rabbi in Britain. He has the connections both with world Jewry and with the world political system. He speaks a very fluent English. I'm sure he's been to Australia. I'm sure he will be visiting Australia during his term as president. Whether he wants to get himself involved in the issue of electoral reform, there have been people, including myself, who have already suggested it, but I think it's too early to say whether that will be the case or not, and whether if he does so, whether one side or another will accuse him of interfering in politics as such. I put this slide on to close the lecture, but that was before we put the new government together. The Knesset is very much open to business at the moment. Actually, the news this morning was all about how they'd been in the chamber all night debating the new law concerning the appointment of dayanim, religious judges to the religious courts. It had gone on all night, and I understand, as in these issues often are, was a very fiery debate with some comments made which would have been best had they not been made, and they're back there today. So they are open for business, but as I say, we spend too much of our time making sure that the coalition is there, making sure that the 61 votes are there, and everything like that takes away from the real time that we should be spending on managing and administering the country. I don't want to end on a negative note. Israel is an extremely good on the democratic scale. And when you take into account that we are, whatever your views on the conflict are, we are in the middle of an ongoing and a perpetual conflict. And it's not easy. It's not easy to have this joint thing of saying we're both a Jewish and a democratic state and ensuring that the 20% Arab Palestinian population inside Israel have all their democratic rights as they do. And they are in the Knesset and they can say what they want about the state, but it's not an easy thing to do. I think we are pretty good on the scale of democracy, but we could be even better. And maybe in the next 10 years, we'll get about to implementing some serious electoral reform. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, David. If you can, that's it, close that. Close your screen sharing. Good. Okay, very, very interesting. So we'll take some questions. I'm going to start with one of mine, and then we'll go to Ron, Reuven, Adam, Leon, Jeff, and Terry. We'll see how we go for time. David, I'm interested, Israel as a brand new country in 1948 with a very small population, where did the number of 120 Knesset seats come from? It seems like a lot for such a what is effectively a small community, and perhaps reducing it to say 100. Would that make any? Would there be any advantage in that in terms of adding to the stability?
There was an argument at the time that it should be 70, Anshe Knesset Agdolah. But 120, you know, it's not a huge number. It's not a huge number, and unlike many other countries, you know, I always make the comparison with Britain. Britain has 650 seats, and it has 60 million population, but that population has stayed pretty much around the 55 to 65 million ever since I was born 65 years ago, and the number of seats has slightly changed as they undertake every few years a number of redrawing of boundaries, but the balance has remained pretty much the same. In Israel, of course, 120 seats when the country was formed with less than 1 million population, you could argue was a large number of seats. Today, you have the same number of seats with a population which is something like 8-9 million. So there are some people who argue we need to up the number of seats until they start comparing it to other countries. And they see we started at such a high number that actually we're, you know, the balance is being synchronized out over time. There's not been any debate about either increasing or decreasing the number of seats, but I don't think that would make any difference to the way the system manages itself. Because as long as you have this direct proportional system, so it's always going to come out as the same thing. You're just going to have more seats or less seats to the same political parties based on did you get 2% of the votes or 22% of the votes. Yeah. I think if you look at a lot of the textbooks on political systems around the world, you'll see they often say even for smaller countries, 100 and 120 is often the minimum you need to administer a country, taking into effect all the different ministries and committees that you need for an administration. But there hasn't been any real discussion of changing that number of seats. And it seems that as the Israeli population is a young population, it's a growing population, which is rare for many Western societies. So the number of people per representative is going to go up over time.
Yeah, Hugh made reference in the chat. I was going to ask you, the numbers 70 and 120 have got a biblical connotation. Was that right factored into it?
There was a bit of a discussion at the time about that. As I say, Anshe Knesset Agdolah, the issue of the Sanhedrin of 70 and so on, there was a discussion. There were a lot of discussions around, you know, to what extent should the new state have all sorts of Jewish, biblical, religious symbols. You know, there was a huge debate over the prayer for the state of Israel, the one that we say in Israel today, which was composed by the present president's grandfather, Rabbi Yitzhak Halevi Herzog, a very impressive personality, indeed. And the same actually thing about the actual Declaration of Independence, where the religious parties wanted to mention the name of God and the secular parties didn't want to. And they used the term Tzur Yisrael, the Rock of Israel, which is in a sense a reference to God or the divine for those who wanted it, but it was not a direct religious terminology. So you'll find that in both the prayer for the state of Israel and in the Declaration of Independence, rather than the term Adonai or Hashem being used, they use the term Tzur Yisrael, the Rock of Israel, and people can interpret that in any way they want.
Okay, thank you, David. Okay, we'll go to some questions. Ron and Reuven first up. So Ron, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, good evening.
Hi.
You mentioned, you know, the proportional system as opposed to the constituency system. What is your, in order to foment and increase stability, what would your opinion be about a hybrid between the two? I think Germany's got a system that has both proportional and a constituency system. It seems to be very stable. What is your opinion about that?
Yeah, no, first of all, contras are not totally correct. It's not proportionality versus constituency, because most countries in the world that have constituencies also have proportionality within the constituencies. The minute you have more than one member per constituency, you have what are called multi-member constituencies. You have a proportional system working out who are going to be, let's say you have 4 members from a constituency, and you have to work out which party is going. It's never a system whereby you have 4 people from a constituency, therefore one party, like in Britain, gets all 4 seats. The idea of having 3 or 4 or 5 members from a constituency is to allow for a number of parties to share representation and power within a constituency. So there's proportionality in the system. The whole issue of constituencies is whether you have local representation or you don't have local representation, because countries without constituencies argue that we, if you'll excuse the expression, we're screwed because the politicians all live in Jerusalem, they all live in Tel Aviv, and they don't really care much about the Galil or the Negev. They'll just come and visit us when they want to get votes and so on. The issue of proportionality is something different. I mean, you have it within a system. What you mentioned about Germany is very common in most European countries, where they have what is called a mixed system. The mixed system means that the number of seats in the parliament is divided between some of them coming from a national list, such as in Israel, and some of them coming from constituencies. So you have both national and local representation, and normally preference or greater importance is given to the local lists for the regional representation than to the national lists. That is the idea of the mixed system. And what happens is, in the local lists, often it's the large parties that win out within each constituency. And there is a topping up effect whereby from the national list, those parties, let's say, that got 15% of votes throughout the country, but because they lost out in the constituencies and didn't get very many seats within the constituency, they get more members from the national list to balance out the system for greater proportionality. I'm not sure if I've explained that very well. It's quite complicated, but there are these checks and balances which are very common in Europe. Germany is an excellent example, and virtually all the countries that came out of communism and the Soviet Union have adopted mixed lists. Whenever you talk about electoral reform, whether it's from in Israel or in Britain, both of which need to reform from opposite directions, there's always a discussion about some form of mixed system.
Okay, thanks, David. Reuven, please unmute yourself, and then I think we've got Jason, and we'll see how we go for time.
Yeah, just a quick one. The political system in Australia since 1901, January 1901, is modelled on the political system of Am Yisrael, which is constitutional monarchy. Reb Steinselt was a member of the new Sanhedrin. We're pushing back for the Commonwealth of Israel to be re-established. God willing, it will happen very soon. But what's become, the question is, what's become of the new Sanhedrin, which is in preparation for the new political system that we look forward to with Mashiach very soon? What's happening? You know,
you're going to have to ask the rabbis about that. I don't think it's a very relevant question to this discussion. There's no serious debate, to the best of my knowledge, about a new Sanhedrin coming into being in the near future. Maybe there should be, but I've not seen it take place in any political forum.
Okay, thanks. Jason, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Look, very quickly, so I haven't heard the word preferential mentioned yet. Now, in Australia, we have a preferential voting system for the House of Representatives. Has that ever been considered in Israel?
It hasn't been considered in Israel, but as you rightly know, you have a preferential system, as do, again, a lot of the countries in Europe which have mixed systems, because you have to decide who gets a second and a third preference vote, who gets a second and a third and a fourth place within multi-member constituencies. And the preferential system is the way that France, for instance, uses a preferential system within its constituencies. It's another method out there. I don't think there's any particular electoral system, be it a mixed system, a preferential system, a multi-member constituency system, a proportional system. There's no system which is perfect. There's no such thing. What you have to do is you always have to balance out your desire for as many groups and people to feel that they're represented within a democracy, even if they're on the losing side of the election. That doesn't mean they don't have representation. The balance between representation and government, stable government. You can have very stable government by just having a one person past the post system in the whole country and saying, well, you know, my party got 52% of votes, your party got 48%, we got 52%, therefore we take all the seats. That would be totally stable. You'd never have any opposition to the government. You'd have virtually half the country unrepresented or not part of the franchise. So what countries are always seeking is to balance these two things, and different countries have found different ways to do it. What I think is fair to say is that Britain and Israel find themselves at the opposite ends of the spectrum, and they need to move somewhere towards the middle where they can balance these things out. Israel has great representation, doesn't have stability. Britain, or at least until a few years ago, had, and certainly today, if you look at the numbers between the Conservative and Labours and the British government today, has great stability, but it doesn't really represent huge chunks of the population. So whether it be France or Australia, they found different ways of manipulating, and by manipulating, I mean in a positive way, so that you can balance these two great objectives out together. Yeah,
thanks. Leon was next, and I think that might have to be the final question, so apologies to the other guys.
In Australia, do women talk politics?
Everyone.
So far, only men have been asking questions.
Leon, please unmute yourself. Leon doesn't have a camera, but ask your question.
Yes, good evening, Professor. Given that it is in the interests of the small parties in the Israeli Knesset to preserve the current system, and given that it is only a majority in the Knesset that can change the electoral system, are not the prospects of change very dim?
Yeah, that's what I more or less said, yes. I mean, in the 90s, it got as far as being discussed in the Law and Constitution Committee of the Knesset, and different mixed systems were discussed, and they even went as far as discussing how many constituencies would there be, and would it be 60-60 or 40-80 from the national and the localist, and it never, and that's the furthest it ever really got as a serious political discussion. It never went further, but I more or less said that to you. It's not on the agenda today because it's not in the interests of the current politicians to change the system in such a way that a different type of person would be running for politics, because many of them feel they'd be voting themselves out of power. Yeah. Okay, look, we'll need to wrap it up because we're running out of time. David, I want to thank you very, very much for joining us. It's a fascinating subject, obviously very complex, and 1 hour is not nearly enough time to do it justice. We'll look forward to seeing you in Israel sometime, and I'll bring you a jar of Marmite next time we come. So thanks for joining us. It's Marmite and not Vegemite. Yeah. Well, we've got both. In fact, I think we've got a third one. So we're happy to do that. But thanks again for joining us. It's a fascinating topic, and we appreciate your time. I think it's time for you to have a cup of tea. Yeah, I certainly agree with you. Yeah. And good cup of English tea. That's right. Some things, even after 40 years in Israel, you don't lose. I'll just hand back to David for a few notes on next week. So thank you. Okay, nice meeting you all. Good night.
Thank you very much again. And we have a special announcement for next week. We have arguably the most celebrity rabbi in America, maybe even in the world. Shmuley Batayach is our guest next week. And we've asked him to talk to us about the Jewish identity in the diaspora as it applies to connection with Israel, which has become a divergent and controversial subject in the US, and we see it happening here as well, with certain groups taking an anti-Israel perspective, etc. So we'll have Shmuley Batayach with us next week. And what you see on your screen at the moment is an advertisement that we will be placing to promote that event. And finally, for those of you who are still with us, the things that you need to do to support AJA, if you haven't yet joined our email list, go to the website jewishassociation.org.au and subscribe for the emails. Like and follow the AJA Facebook page for news and views. And if you are not yet a member, go to the website, please, and apply for membership or make a donation, because that's the only way we can function. So thank you, Alan. Thank you to our guest, Professor David Newman. Very informative.
Thanks, David. Yeah, thanks. So on that note, we'll wish everybody good night and look forward to joining you next week, with what promises to be a fascinating discussion. So from me, on behalf of the AJA, it's good night to you all, and we'll see you again in a week's time. Bye for now.